All right, hello. How's the sound? Okay. So thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Matthias and Bob, for organizing this really great talk series. I went to the first one, and I'm looking forward to going to as many as I can. So we're going to talk about attention. And if you've ever tried to meet a friend in a crowded place like Times Square, you know that we cannot fully process all the information that's coming into our eyes at any given time, right? So attention is this cognitive capacity that allows us to prioritize some information at the expense of other information. So for example, we can use spatial attention to attend to kind of the right side of space if we might be expecting our friend to come over from this direction, or if we know that our friend is wearing a white shirt, we can use what's called feature-based attention. Oh, that's okay. I have a little doubling of the sound here. Yeah, that's okay. We can use feature-based attention to focus on those white colors, right? And if you focus on those white colors, the kind of white shirt should all pop right out at you. If you focus on the black colors, those black shirts should all pop out at you, right? Okay. So this is Consciousness Club, and we know that attention is closely connected with consciousness. So how many of you have seen this demo here? Okay, I think most people have seen it. So I'll just say that in this very famous demo of inattentional blindness, attending to the white shirted team and counting how many times they're passing the basketball back and forth can actually make people completely unaware of this very hairy interloper that is entering in the middle, right in the middle of the scene, right? So many people don't notice the appearance of that gorilla. Here's another example. This is change blindness. So in the middle, we have change blindness. So I'm alternating here between two pictures. There is a difference between those two pictures. Can you raise your hand if you have seen the difference? Some people have seen it. Just keep your hand up if you could. You can see. Yeah. If you haven't seen it yet, the difference is on the left, somewhere on the left, and it's blue. Okay, so this is change blindness, right? You're looking right at the scene, you're looking for the change, and it's not that subtle once you've seen it. But you can't see it unless you're attending to that location. And finally, the final example I'll give is hemispatial neglect. In hemispatial neglect, people with right parietal lobe damage actually don't notice things that are on the left side of space unless their attention is explicitly drawn to those things. So someone with hemispatial neglect might draw a clock that looks something like this, where they fill in all the numbers on the right, but just sort of leave the ones on the left out because they're not representing that left half of space in their minds due to a kind of what's thought of as a kind of failure of attention to the left side of space. So all of these examples illustrate how inattention can lead us to being unaware of objects in our environment. Some people say that you need attention in order to be conscious of something. Other people argue against that idea. But basically, everyone agrees that attention shapes what we see in two ways. So first, attention improves objective performance. So under this category, we place any task where there is a right answer. So performance can be objectively better or worse. So for example, attention improves objective performance in many different kinds of tasks: threshold detection, discriminability of visual features, contrast sensitivity, spatial resolution, visual acuity. So for example, if you are looking at that cross in the center, and then I ask you to attend to the stimulus on the left, you're going to be better at discriminating that slight tilt, whether it's clockwise or counterclockwise or vertical, compared to the stimulus on the right. So that's objective performance. Now, attention also enhances subjective perception. Under this category, we place any task where there is actually not a right answer. So the experiment can't tell you, oh, that answer is right, that answer is wrong. In subjective perception tasks, people are just reporting about how something looks to them. Okay, so under this category, attention increases subjective visibility, confidence in what you saw, the apparent contrast of stimuli, perceived spatial frequency, perceived color saturation, and the list goes on. So for example, if you put your eyes here on this black dot in the center of that display, and then direct your attention over here to the left, this stimulus, which is actually lower, physically a lower contrast than this stimulus on the right, was shown by a study in Marisa Carrasco's lab to be perceived as equal in contrast to this stimulus on the right when you were tending over here to the left. Okay, so attention can boost the apparent contrast of stimuli. Okay, so in consciousness science, we're really interested in understanding these mechanisms of subjective perception, right? How this experience of things, how people's conscious subjective experience of things gets generated. And because attention has all these effects on subjective perception, on the face of it, we might think that attention would be a really ideal tool to investigate the mechanisms of conscious perception, including the neural mechanisms. However, there's a challenge that we run into in this line of investigation, which is that attention generally makes everything we measure go up, okay? So attention typically, not always, but typically increases objective performance, subjective strength, neural responses. Okay, so this covariation, meaning everything changes together, and this unidimensionality, meaning things just go up or they go down, make it often difficult to isolate attentional impacts and mechanisms that are specific to subjective perception. And it's usually not clear whether attention is changing subjective perception in a way that can be pulled apart from other processing that might be completely unrelated to conscious experience. Okay, so this is a kind of experimental methodological challenge that we face in this field. So today, in two studies, I am going to tell you about how we tackle this question. How does attention affect subjective perception specifically? In the first study, study 1, we address this covariation problem by asking whether and how attention affects subjective perception when objective performance is controlled. And in study 2, we address this unidimensionality problem by asking whether and how attention can warp perceptual appearance rather than just boosting subjective strength. Okay, so let's start with study 1, which is just one part of a very large so-called adversarial collaboration to test first order versus higher order theories of consciousness. The goal of the part of the project that my lab is working on, together with the lab of Megan Peters at UCI, is to determine whether recurrent processing in visual cortex, which is considered first order sensory processing, is sufficient to explain subjective conscious visual perception. In particular, is sufficient to explain subjective perception when it comes apart from objective performance. Now, the study I'm going to talk about here is the first part of that project. And this is a behavioral study that was led by Karen Tian in my lab, who is there, as well as Brian Maniscalco in Megan Peters' lab at UCI. Okay, so the starting point for this project is there is this intriguing potential dissociation between objective and subjective perception, which is known as inattentional subjective inflation. This inattentional subjective inflation refers to findings that when objective performance is matched, unattended stimuli have been reported as more visible than attended ones. It's kind of strange. Unattended are reported as more visible than attended ones when the stimuli are tweaked so that objective performance is matched. This finding has led to the view that in the unattended visual periphery, our phenomenal experience can be kind of inflated compared to our objective performance. That is, we can experience things as stronger, sharper, or more vivid than the accuracy of sensory processes would suggest. Okay. The idea of subjective inflation has had a pretty large influence on consciousness science. It has motivated higher order theories of consciousness, which kind of say as part of their core predictions that there should be decoupling between objective and subjective experience. It has also offered an explanation for the apparent richness of conscious perception in the peripheral visual field. So based on phenomena like inattentional blindness that we just talked about and other types of behavioral evidence, you might think that, wow, we're just really unaware of anything outside of our central attentional focus. And yet, when we introspect about our field of vision, it doesn't really seem to be this way. It actually seems to look a little more like this, maybe sort of blurrier toward the edges, but generally there. And subjective inflation has been proposed as an explanation for this putative discrepancy. It would say that the unattended periphery is just inflated in our consciousness. And in both the neuroscience and philosophy literatures, subjective inflation is often really discussed as an established phenomenon. So I've listed a lot of studies here, and this is not an exhaustive list of papers that really rely on subjective inflation in some substantive way. Okay, so here's where the quandary part comes in. The quandary is that the empirical basis for this phenomenon of inattentional inflation is actually very limited. It's only been tested at near threshold stimulus strengths, only for low-level visual features like luminance, contrast, and it has relied on kind of null effects to equate objective performance. So one might worry, was objective performance really the same in these studies? And in general, there's actually just very few studies. And the ones that we have some mixed results. And compared to sort of all the papers on the previous slide that rely on subjective inflation being true, compelling evidence for this phenomenon really only comes from this one study, the Ranev 2011. And so if subjective inflation really matters for our everyday experience, it should actually be robust. It should not be hard to find in studies. It should extend beyond threshold vision. It should extend beyond low-level features. So here we asked, is attentional inflation real? And is it pervasive? Like we set out to really rigorously test this phenomenon. And we did so in four experiments where we have a combination of kind of 2x2 design with two stimulus types, contrast-defined grading, sort of representing this low-level visual feature category, and also texture-defined figure ground oval. So this is considered like a mid-level visual stimulus that relies on texture segmentation processes in order to perceive it. So can you perceive this, this oval, this vertical oval that's standing out against the background texture? Yeah, so this is the oval stimulus that we're talking about. We also tested 2 strength regimes. So that includes a threshold regime, this kind of the regime that's been, so this basically corner of this screen is what was shown in the Ranev 2011 paper. So we're testing this threshold regime where the grading orientation is very hard to see in the noise, and the oval is very hard to see against the background because the lines are very small and it doesn't create a very strong impression or a strong signal for figure ground segmentation. Okay, and so we go all the way from this threshold regime up to this super threshold regime where stimuli are easily visible. So we are investigating inattentional subjective inflation, so we need to manipulate attention. We did this using a spatial attentional cueing task. So in this task, observer's task is to discriminate the orientation of one of those kinds of stimuli. In some experiments, the grading stimuli. In some experiments, the figure ground stimuli. We had 4 stimuli presented on the screen on every trial. And at the end of the trial, we have a response cue, which tells participants which quadrant, which location they have to report. So this cue tells the participants they have to report the orientation of the upper right stimulus. And then we manipulate attention using a pre-cue. So this is a spatial pre-cue, which the white arm says which quadrant you should attend to. So this valid trials, which are most of the trials, we ask participants to attend to the same quadrant that they're later asked to report. In a smaller fraction of trials, which are invalid trials, the pre-cue kind of misdirects attention. We're instructing participants to attend to a different quadrant than the one they're later asked to report. And finally, in neutral trials, the pre-cues point to all spatial locations. They're uninformative about which target they're going to be later asked to report. And so participants have to kind of distribute attention across the entire display. Okay, is the task clear so far?
Yep.
Okay. So in the threshold regime, we want to understand how people are able to perceive these very faint stimuli. And so the tilts are always very distinct from each other. So the tilts for the gradings can be either -45 or +45. The tilts for the ovals is either a kind of very elongated oval, either clearly around vertical or on the horizontal axis. And then we ask people to make this simultaneous report in order to measure both their objective performance and their subjective perception. The simultaneous report is, first of all, we ask them to give us their objective report, which is the orientation. Is it, which way is this thing tilted, minus or +45, vertical or horizontal? And then for the subjective report, we ask them to just tell us, did you see a stimulus? And we're very, we're very clear about, we want you to tell us what you really saw, not just whether you think there was something there or not, but like, how did it look to you? What did you see? So we're asking them to give this simultaneous objective and subjective report. Did you see a stimulus? Yes or no? Okay, so we measure these subjective and objective reports across a range of contrast values. So this is even within the threshold regime. We find people's threshold contrast value, and then we vary a little bit below and a little bit above that to sweep out a full psychometric function. So what I'm plotting here for objective performance on the left is going to be the proportion of correct discrimination in the orientation task as a function of that stimulus contrast. And so in the neutral condition, we're going to see, this very beautiful psychometric function going from chance performance all the way up to very good performance. And then this is mirrored in the subjective visibility report. So here I'm plotting the proportion of time that you actually saw that a stimulus was present as a function of the stimulus contrast. And again, we're getting, very little, very small proportion of time that they reported the stimulus being present, all the way up to a very high proportion. So now I'm going to add what happened when you were actually attending to the quadrant that you were later asked to report in the valid trial in blue. And what we can see is that attention beautifully enhances objective performance, as we would expect from many other experiments. And indeed, performance is quite impaired for all the quadrants where people were not attending in red. And this pattern is similar for the subjective visibility reports. More likely to report that you saw the thing when you're validly cued, when you're attending it, less likely to report that you saw it when you're not attending. Okay, so now comes the trick, where how are we going to look at the effect of attention on subjective perception while we control for objective performance? And the way that we do this is we simply plot the subjective measure, the probability that you saw the stimulus, on the y-axis against the objective measure, the proportion correct, on the x-axis. So this looks something like that. And what you can see here is that at every sort of vertical line, if I pass a vertical line through this plot, the proportion correct discrimination, the objective performance is constant. And now we can see what effect attention has on the subjective perception over and above that objective performance. Okay, so we're controlling for objective performance at every vertical line as we sweep across this space. And we see that for every vertical line we can draw, the red line is higher than the blue line. Okay, so the unattended proportion that you saw the stimulus when it's unattended is actually higher than when it's attended. So that's true here, 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 right? So we're sweeping across this full psychometric function, and we can summarize the effect of attention on this relationship between subjective and objective performance using a simple summary measure, which is the AUC, which is the area under this curve. This is highest when it's unattended, intermediate for neutral, and lowest for valid attended conditions, right? So what this shows is a very robust subjective inflation. When you're not attending to the stimulus, you're more likely to say you saw it when objective performance is controlled. Okay, and I just want to, I realize I want to make sure to plug this great preprint and toolbox, which is built by Brian Maniscalco and Megan Peters' lab, which allows you to fit what we call these type 2 psychometric functions. So type 2 meaning we're plotting some subjective measure against some objective measure, rather than plotting those measures against a physical stimulus strength, which would be the type 1 psychometric function. So this is a very useful toolbox for being able to relate these different kind of psychophysical report measures. Okay, so far so good. We've got our inflation for threshold gratings. Let's see now what happened in the other situation. So this so far is replicating the Ronev 2011 experiment. What about for this sort of mid-level type of texture-defined figure ground stimulus? Does subjective inflation occur for these figure ground stimuli? Yes, it does. So very nice, also very strong subjective inflation for the threshold figure ground stimuli. Okay, what about in a super threshold regime? So now, not just when things are very faint at threshold, but when you can clearly see them, when they're strongly visible, just like in our everyday vision. And in order to do this, we needed to actually change the task, because now we can't just ask participants whether they could see the stimulus or not. because they could see all of these stimuli. They were super threshold by design. So of course they could see them. So instead, we developed a different task, which is a subjective strength comparison task, where we trained participants on a reference stimulus strength and then asked whether the stimulus appeared stronger or weaker to them than that reference strength. Okay, so now that's the new subjective report here. How strong did the target appear? Did it appear stronger than the reference, or did it appear weaker than the reference? And we also made the orientation discrimination task challenging by adjusting either the tilts of the grading so they're more close to vertical, or adjusting the aspect ratio of the oval so that they're more close to circles, so that both of these measures would be meaningful. We could get meaningful discrimination measures, and we could get meaningful subjective strength measures. Okay, so with this comparison, superthreshold comparison task in hand, let's see what happened. So we actually found that inflation at superthreshold was huge, like even more pronounced than at threshold, for both the contrast-defined gratings and for the texture-defined figure ground stimuli. Okay, so taken together, then these 4 experiments, this seemed like pretty strong evidence that inattentional inflation is like a real phenomenon, and it's widespread. It occurs for both these threshold and superthreshold regimes. It occurs for stimuli that are processed at different points along the visual processing hierarchy. But before we went too far in getting excited about this result, we had to consider this question. Okay, are people just basing the objective and subjective reports on different stimulus information? Okay, so just as in this kind of grainy security video, where you can tell a person is there without necessarily relying on something like facial features that would indicate their identity, it could be that participants might report visibility based on some stimulus information that is separate from the orientation signal that's driving their objective performance, right? So maybe they cannot discriminate the orientation, but they can still see the stimulus, some other features of the stimulus. And this would make it more likely that the subjective and objective reports could decouple and come apart. And this idea is related to what our own Matthias Michael has called the criterion content fallacy, the fallacy of concluding that subjects are conscious of the task-relevant features of the stimulus based on the mere evidence that they are conscious of something, right? So they might be conscious of something, but not conscious of the task-relevant features. Okay, so we needed to ask, does subjective inflation occur also for the feature that's relevant for this objective task? So far, I've only told you about reports about whether people saw the stimulus or didn't see the stimulus. But in fact, in 3 of the 4 experiments, we also included this kind of breakdown of the scene category. We included 3 visibility response options, dividing the scene response into these 2 options. One is I saw a stimulus and its orientation. So that would be they saw the stimulus and they saw the task relevant feature. And then the next step option is I saw a stimulus, but I didn't see its orientation. So they didn't see the task relevant feature. So this kind of 3-level visibility scale is going to allow us to quantify specifically the task relevant feature visibility. Okay, so let's look at how whether we still see subjective inflation, where we talk about the visibility reports as the probability that they saw the feature, the task relevant feature. And we see that for contrast-defined gratings at threshold, we still see this very nice subjective inflation, even when we force people to say, this is for the task relevant feature. This was also true, though a bit weaker, for the texture-defined figure ground ovals at threshold. However, at super threshold, this did not hold up. Okay, so you remember the big effects of the stimulus inflation at super threshold? When we specifically told people, no, we want you to tell us about whether you could see the task relevant feature, the strength of the task relevant feature in this case, that inflation goes away. Now, objective performance really fully predicts the subjective visibility report, regardless of the attentional state. Okay, so all told, it seems like inflation is real, at least at threshold. It survives this strong test of asking people to report the subjective visibility of the task relevant feature, but it may not hold up in this strong test for this super threshold strengths. Okay, so the final question we want to answer is, where does inflation actually come from, right? On the face of it, it seems to be a kind of paradoxical phenomenon. When you're not attending, you somehow see more, or than you should. What's going on here? So to gain insight into this question, we took advantage of the fact that we had measured these full psychometric functions in order to examine how attention changes the internal signals related to performance and related to visibility. So in order to compare these psychometric functions directly, we use these common units of stimulus strength. So here I'm plotting performance in blue, attended and unattended, solid and dotted, and visibility in this kind of dark green color, attended in solid and unattended in dotted. And on the x-axis this is for gradings. So on the x-axis is contrast, so stimulus strength. And for performance, we picked this starting in order to compare the effect of attention on these two measures, which are in fact in different units on the y-axis. What we did was we did it in units of stimulus strength and units of contrast. So we picked a starting strength, this unattended contrast value here, and then we looked up what would be the stimulus strength that's required to produce an equivalent level of visibility in this case, or an equivalent level of performance in this case in blue. Okay, so we're measuring this horizontal distance between the equivalent performance levels at two different contrasts, or equivalent visibility levels at two different contrasts. And this effectively allows us to directly compare these two very different kinds of reports and these two very different kinds of measures. And when we did this, what we see is that for any starting point, any contrast starting point we can use, we see that the effect of attention on the effective stimulus strength, so this difference is like the change in effective stimulus strength with attention, is always higher for performance in blue than for visibility in green. Okay, so this is for experiment 1 with threshold gradings, where we see this performance change is just greater than the visibility change. And these are for all the other experiments. And we can see that this general result, that the effective contrast change for performance is just greater than for visibility, holds up for all these experiments, with the one exception of this super threshold gradings feature visibility, this dark green line here, where we didn't find inflation at all. Okay, so that was a situation where we didn't find inflation at all. So these findings suggest kind of a general principle that inflation occurs because attention increases the effective stimulus strength more for performance than for visibility. And indeed, we can also show just mathematically that inflation always occurs under these conditions, and in fact only occurs under these conditions. So we can kind of prove a kind of identity of that relationship. And so we propose that this finding here is kind of the more fundamental empirical fact about what attention does to objective versus subjective perception. So rather than what might seem at first like a kind of a paradoxical inflation of unattended items, inflation instead seems to reflect stronger effects of attention on performance thresholds compared to visibility thresholds. And now it's still an open question on why that happens. But at least this is a kind of reframing of the idea, and we can start to think about ways that the readout for performance and visibility might be different, and so on and so forth, perhaps from the same underlying signals. Okay, so to conclude this part about subjective inflation. So subjective inflation under inattention is robust. Like, we did test a lot, many things, and it's quite robust. It's robust across full psychometric functions. It's robust across these both threshold and super threshold stimulus strength regimes, and it occurs for both these low-level grading stimuli and mid-level texture-defined figure ground stimuli. However, it's not ubiquitous. Okay, so subjective reports of the task-relevant feature do not inflate for super threshold stimuli. And this specific inflation failure is actually important, because it means that the apparent richness of the visual periphery in everyday vision probably doesn't arise from a kind of inflated subjective perception of visual discriminability, but instead from the subjective perception of kind of coarser stimulus information that is discriminable in the periphery, which is also consistent with work by Michael Cohen, Ruth Rosenholtz, and Andrew Hahn, among others. And finally, we came to this unifying principle that attention increases effective stimulus strength more for performance than for visibility, which seems to underlie these findings of subjective inflation in all of these regimes. All right, so that's the end of the first study. Let's carry on. In the next study, we're going to study 2, asking how does attention affect subjective perception beyond boosting subjective strength. This study was led by Angus Chapman, a postdoc in my lab, who I think is also there, who is also currently on the job market. Look out for that guy. As well as Melissa Lush, who was an MA student in the lab. Okay, so we talked at the beginning about the effect that attention has on subject perception, and many of them can be summarized as attention increases perceived intensity, right? So in all of these situations, attention increases visibility, confidence, apparent contrast, and so on and so forth. But there are also some indications that this is not the only thing that attention does, that attention can also warp the appearance of visual features. And that's what we're quite interested in here. So the main evidence for attentional warping of appearance comes from findings that attention distorts the appearance of visual space. Attending to a specific location in space has been found to expand perceived space around that attended location, increasing perceived sizes at that location, and increasing perceived distances between objects around that location. So for example, this monkey right here, who's attending to this banana, if he's not attending, if he's like looking away from the banana, maybe the banana will be perceived as smaller than when he focuses attention on this banana, and now it sort of enlarges the apparent size of this object, right? And there's all these white circles on this region, on this image, because I've grabbed this image from a review that suggests that this enlargement of visual space around attended locations can be due to shifts in receptive fields toward an attended location, which result in these kind of distortions of appearance. However, it's unknown what happens farther from the attended location. Like, what about all the way out here? What's happening to space all the way out there? It's also known what happens to other visual features. So this has mainly been studied in terms of perception of space, but what about other visual features, orientation, color, you name it. And in general, the effect of attention on the appearance of an entire feature space has not been measured so far. So here we asked, how does attention affect the appearance of a full perceptual feature space? And when we're thinking about characterizing appearance across a perceptual feature space, we can kind of think of, there's our classic discrimination tasks. Those are good for characterizing perceptual sensitivity. They're usually done at a single feature value, like discriminate clockwise versus counterclockwise tilt around vertical. And this just means that they're blind to most of the feature space, right? You can ask whether attention improves perception of those tilts or like around your actual target, but you don't know what's happening to perception of any other stimuli that you're not showing, right? And that's the main reason why we don't know how attention affects the whole space. Comparison tasks in general are better for characterizing appearance. You can quantify not just whether you can tell two stimuli apart, but how different or how similar they look. And in principle, they can assess similarity across all possible feature values. So we took that approach of using a comparison task, and our goal was to characterize the representational geometry of a perceptual feature space. So the representational geometry characterizes the similarity structure of a feature space. In this example here, I'm showing you a kind of a toy example. This is a distance matrix where more yellow colors are more dissimilar. And you can see that there's a bunch of different object shapes on this axis and this axis. You can think about these pairs of objects. How similar or dissimilar are they? The parrot and the plane are rated as pretty similar, so they have a short distance between them. The frog and the plane are pretty different. They're rated as pretty dissimilar, so they have a longer distance between them. Right? So you can collect all these pairwise similarity judgments for all of the stimuli in your space, and then you can use those pairwise similarity judgments to extract some sort of geometry, some geometrical arrangement where the distances in this space predicts the similarity judgments that people gave to begin with. Okay, so this is the idea. We want to recover the representational geometry of the perceptual feature space, and we want to figure out how attention changes that geometry. So to do that, we picked the simplest feature we could think of instead of space, and that feature is orientation. So orientation goes from horizontal to vertical and back again in a circular space. And the sort of theoretical representational geometry for orientation, this would just be based on the physical stimulus features, right? Just the angular distances between all of these stimuli would produce a geometry that, unsurprisingly, is a circle, just a 2D flat circle, which records the angular distances around this feature space of geometry. So the question then is, what is attention going to do to this feature space? So we can think about, again, this sort of base space of, maybe a 2D space where we have this orientations here with no attention. We have two hypothesized, possibilities for what attention might do to this feature space. One possibility is that it could expand the representational space around the target orientation. So in this case, I'm showing an example of attending to plus 45 degrees. If you attend to this orientation, maybe nearby orientations now look more dissimilar, more different from that 45-degree orientation, essentially expanding that part of the representational space. So that could be something that happens. And that's basically consistent with what the spatial attention literature has shown. But then we kind of wonder, right? We've talked about, we know some things about what happens around the target. We don't know how far this extends. Like, is it very narrow? Is it very broad? but we also don't know like what happens everywhere else, right? So one example is, one possibility is nothing happens everywhere else. There's just target expansion around this attended orientation. But another possibility is there could also be, maybe compression around more distant items. So maybe things that you're not attending to now start to look more similar to each other and less discriminable. Okay, so to test this, we use this kind of combined attention and perceptual similarity task. It had two phases which were interleaved. In the first phase, we wanted to set up people's feature-based attention. We wanted to get them to have a sustained period of attention to one visual feature. So we had two types of trials. In the trials that were all cued based on this color of the plus at the beginning, they were asked to attend to whichever set of lines were in this cued color. So they could attend to either the black lines or they could attend to the white lines. And during this 3-second period, they were asked to, let's say, attend to the black lines and then count these very small changes in tilts that were happening every now and then in the stream. So these stimuli were kind of jittering around the screen, they were moving, they were overlaid. And so people needed to really attend to the black ones to select them, to monitor them for those small changes in tilts. There could be 0 to 3 tilts, and we thresholded this task so it was difficult for everyone. And at the end of this period, we have what we really kind of care about, which is this perceptual similarity task. This is what we call a triad task. We present 3 stimuli, a central reference stimulus, and then one on the left and one on the right. And we ask participants to tell us which stimulus, the one on the left or the one on the right, looks more similar to the reference stimulus. So this is a kind of appearance task. This is a comparison task. They need to report how similar or different do these 2 pairs of stimuli look. And so this ended up giving us 2 different sort of orientation attention conditions, either attend to -45 or attend to +45. But also we had some trials where there was no attention. So we just had trials of this triad task only without having any attentional state induced beforehand. Okay, so that was the design, to set up people's attentional state, attend to one feature, and then probe how did that attentional state make these other features look. Okay, and we need a lot of trials for this, many. Good job, Angus. Okay, so all right, so the first sanity check here is that we wanted to see that the number of tilts that people reported actually tracked the number of tilts that were happening for the target orientation, but not for the distractor orientation, the unattended orientation. And that was the case. So on the left, we see that reported tilts are pretty much tracking in this diagonal. The number of reported tilts are tracking the number of target tilts with some underestimation. And the correlation for that was very high. As compared to the distractor tilts, people are completely insensitive to the number of distractor tilts. So they were doing a very good job at attending to the right thing in this task. So that just confirms that participants were performing this feature-based attention task accurately. This allowed us to generate these dissimilarity matrices. I'm just showing this group average dissimilarity matrix, where each little pixel on this array shows how similar or dissimilar the 2 orientations were reported based on those comparisons in the triad task. And so the thing that we did next, in order to estimate this representational geometry, was we fit geometric models to this trial-by-trial behavioral data, asking how all of the stimulus orientations would have to be positioned within an n-dimensional space such that their pairwise distances would best predict these similarity choices that people made in the triad task. And we found that actually, instead of the two-dimensional physical orientation space, it was a four-dimensional model that best predicted the data. Here, I can't really plot the 4 dimensions very easily, but I'm going to plot the three-dimensional fit for visualization. And as you can see, the structure of orientation perception is actually not a 2D circle as would be expected from the physical stimulus features, but rather in 3D, we see this saddle shape. And in 4D, there's additional loops that emerge. So we know we're measuring something about the subjective aspects of perception because that is not in the physical stimulus, right? Okay. Even in this 3D model, you can already start to see some separation between the attention conditions. So here, the red line shows the attend minus 45 condition, blue line shows attend plus 45, gray line shows no attention. And you can see that nearby those attended stimulus locations, we start to get some separation between these representational spaces here and here. Okay. So to quantify this expansion where this red is kind of further out than the blue, for example, and the blue further out than the red, to quantify this expansion, what we did was calculate a local length of the representation in sliding windows as we took a window and kind of slid it around the this manifold. So that would tell us how big is the space at each sort of orientation bin. And that's what I'm plotting here. So now on the y-axis, I'm plotting that local length as a function of orientation on the x-axis. So again, this is the distance around the orientation representation within each sliding window. The dotted lines here show the target orientations at -45 and +45. Again, red is a 10 minus 45, blue is a 10 plus 45, and gray is no attention. And the squares up here indicate significant differences between the attention conditions. What you can see is that the local length is overall longer around the target orientations, around the task relevant orientations. And on top of that effect, we see this attentional modulation. So attention to one orientation further expands the representation of orientation around both targets. So this is a 10 minus 45 is further expanding the representation around -45. A 10 plus 45 is further expanding the representation around +45. Here we collapsed across the target orientations and then vary the size of the sliding window. Now we're just centering it around the target orientation in orange or around the distractor orientation in purple. And the no attention condition is still in gray here. And we see that for a large range of these sliding window sizes, there's a consistent expansion around target orientations and a consistent compression around distractor orientations with shorter lengths. And then neutral, the no attention condition, this gray line is kind of somewhere in the middle. So we reason then that target expansion and distractor compression, they might actually have different optimal window sizes. So the next thing we did was just examine the target versus distractor length difference for all possible combinations of target and distractor window sizes. And what emerged from this analysis is that the attention effect was strongest with a relatively narrow window around the target. It's a relatively narrow expansion around the target of about 40 degrees, and a relatively broad window of compression around distractors, about 120 degrees. The maximum attention effect is indicated by this red dot here, and the black outline shows the significant region of window sizes. So to summarize, what we see is similar to this picture that I showed you at the beginning, right? There was a narrow expansion with attention around targets and a broad compression around distractors, such that in the end, the effect of attention on this warping of this perceptual space really kind of applies to almost the entire stimulus space. There aren't that many orientations that are completely unaffected by this. And finally, the last thing I'll say just very briefly is that we also found that a neural population tuning model with gain and normalization can capture both of these properties. They can capture both the narrow expansion around attended orientations and the broad compression around unattended orientations. But we do need a kind of normalization in this model to make that work. So this is just a brief teaser on the modeling. Okay, so to conclude this section, we found that attention to a specific orientation altered the relative appearance of almost all orientations in the space by reshaping the entire perceptual feature space. Representations expanded in a narrow range around attended orientations or compressed in a broad range around distractor unattended orientations. And these representational changes were captured by a neural population model with attentional gain and normalization. So the kind of take home from this is that attention does not only enhance, it does not only boost and enhance relevant features, but it also actually distorts perception. And it does that really throughout the entire feature space. And as Angus has speculated in a really beautiful review article, this kind of a warping of representational geometry by attention in principle could actually really allow more efficient transfer of behaviorally relevant information to downstream areas that might need it. So I want to wrap up today with my last slide, which is attempting to bring these studies back to think about what are the implications for consciousness science, since we are here at Consciousness Club. All right, so the first point is that across both of these studies, we see that attention decouples subjective perception from both objective performance and from physical stimulus features. And this, I would propose, provides opportunities to identify neural activity that is specific to subjective perception when the physical stimulus or when performance are controlled. So this can help us identify better mappings to neural signatures. Second, here I've shown you two different methods for characterizing what are really detailed patterns of subjective perception. So not just is it getting bigger or smaller, but how is it changing across full psychometric functions? How is it affecting these full kind of representational geometry type perceptual geometry representations? And these approaches provide targets for richer and thus more constrained mappings. Again, not just going up and down, but richer, more constrained mappings between neural activity and perceptual experience. And so these approaches, I would propose, can actually help to advance consciousness science beyond the seen versus unseen comparisons that have dominated the field for many years. And with that, I would like to thank the many people who contributed to this work, and especially the people who were the primary drivers of these projects, which is Karen Tian, Angus Chapman, and Melissa Alush, and at UCI, Megan Peters and Brian Maniscalco. And thank you all. Thank you so much for being here.